To understand the profound shock experienced by German soldiers upon encountering American supply depots, one must first comprehend the stark reality of the German war economy and the military doctrine it necessitated. The Wehrmacht that marched across Europe was not the impeccably supplied, uniformly equipped mechanized juggernaut of Allied propaganda. It was, instead, an army built for lightning victory, whose logistical tail was dangerously short and whose survival increasingly depended on a brutal, unsustainable practice, scavenging from the battlefield and the lands it conquered. This was not a temporary measure, but a fundamental principle that shaped the German soldiers' entire experience of the war. The German Blitzkrieg doctrine was designed to win wars in weeks, not years. Its terrifying effectiveness in Poland, France, and the early stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union masked a critical vulnerability. The German economy was not on a total war footing. Under the delusion that the conflicts would be short, German industry continued to produce consumer goods alongside military hardware well into 1942. The logistical system was designed for short, sharp campaigns, relying on railroads for major supply and a shocking dependence on horse-drawn transport for final distribution to the front. The army that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 was less than 20% motorized, the rest moved on foot, with over 600,000 horses pulling its supply wagons, artillery, and field kitchens. This created a fatal mismatch. A strategy of lightning speed was powered by a supply system moving at a walk. When the Soviet Union did not collapse as predicted, and the war devolved into a grueling war of attrition, this system broke down completely. The German soldier found himself in a perpetual state of want. Rations were meager, often limited to bread, ersatz coffee, and a thin sausage or canned meat. The iconic iron ration was a source of dark humor, a can of ancient meat to be opened only in extremity. Ammunition was frequently rationed, with strict limits imposed on artillery shells per day. Fuel was a constant crisis, with panzer divisions often immobilized for lack of gasoline, their advances stalling not by enemy action, but by empty tanks. This scarcity bred a culture of systematic looting. The German war machine, from its highest commands to its lowest Lanzer, operated on the principle of living off the land. In France, they confiscated wine, cheese, and livestock. In the Ukraine, they seized grain and oil. This was not random pillaging but an organized policy to feed the army and send resources back to the Reich. For the individual soldier, it became a matter of survival. A successful raid on a Soviet supply dump could yield real bread, tobacco, and, most prized of all, American Lend-Lease canned goods like Spam, which were far superior to German rations. Their equipment reflected this scavenger economy. A single German infantry company might be armed with a mix of Karabiner 98K rifles, captured Soviet PPSH 41 submachine guns, and French machine guns, all requiring different, often scarce, ammunition. This experience conditioned the German soldier to a world defined by scarcity. His reality was one of constant calculation: how many rounds remained, how far the next field kitchen was, whether the fuel truck would arrive before the enemy counterattacked. He learned to view the enemy not just as a combatant, but as a source of potential supply. A dead Soviet soldier might have a pouch of Macorker tobacco, a knocked-out T-34 might have salvageable parts or fuel. This was their scavenger mindset, a deeply ingrained belief that war was a contest of endurance fought on the edge of deprivation, where every resource was precious and nothing was wasted. It was this mindset, forged in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front and the grinding battles of North Africa, that collided with the reality of the American way of war. The German soldier had been taught, through brutal experience, that all armies ultimately suffered the same privations. He believed the stories of American decadence and weakness were true, that their wealth would not translate to battlefield endurance. He was prepared for a fight against another hungry army. He was not prepared for what he would find when the tide turned and he began stumbling into the rear areas of the advancing American forces. The world of plenty he was about to discover would shatter his understanding of modern warfare and demoralize him in a way no single defeat ever could. The scavenger was about to walk into a horn of plenty, and the sight would forever change his perception of the enemy he faced. While the German soldier learned to survive on scavenged crusts and captured fuel, a tectonic shift in global production was underway an ocean away. The United States, emerging from the Great Depression, was undergoing the most spectacular industrial mobilization in human history. This was not merely an increase in military production, it was the total conversion of the world's largest economy into a single, purpose-driven machine, their arsenal of democracy. The output of this arsenal would not just equip the American armed forces, it would supply its allies and ultimately redefine the very logic of warfare, replacing the calculus of scarcity with the overwhelming power of abundance. The catalyst was the fall of France in 1940. The sight of a modern European power collapsing in weeks sent a shockwave through the American establishment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, with prescient foresight, began the mobilization even before the United States was formally in the war. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 was the opening salvo, turning the US into the workshop for Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. But it was the attack on Pearl Harbor that threw the master switch. The nation's vast industrial complex converted to a war footing with a unity and speed that defied all pre-war predictions. This was not a gradual build-up, it was an explosion of productive energy. The statistics of this mobilization remain staggering decades later. Automobile plants that once built Chevrolets and Chryslers were retooled almost overnight. The Ford Motor Company's colossal Willow Run plant was conceived to produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. By 1944, it was rolling a finished bomber off its mile-long assembly line every 63 minutes. Henry Kaiser's shipyards applied assembly line techniques to naval construction, achieving the impossible. The time to build a Liberty ship, the vital supply vessel of the Allied corps, was reduced from 365 days to a mere 42. At its peak, a new Liberty ship was being launched every single day. This was not merely production, it was the industrialization of creation itself. This philosophy of mass production was the antithesis of the German model. German industry, often artisanal in nature, focused on quality and complexity, producing masterpieces of engineering like the Tiger tank. American industry focused on quantity, standardization, and reliability. The Sherman tank was not designed to be the best tank on the battlefield, it was designed to be good enough, and to be available in overwhelming numbers. The US could produce 10 Shermans for every Tiger Germany built. This same principle applied to every piece of equipment. The iconic Jeep, the rugged GMC Juice and a Half truck, and the M1 Garand rifle were all designed to be effective, easy to mass-produce, and simple to maintain and repair in the field. The centerpiece of this land-based arsenal was logistics itself. The US Army understood that a modern military was a machine that ran on gasoline, spare parts, and ammunition. American factories produced over 800,000 military trucks during the war, a number that dwarfed German output. They produced millions of jerrycans for fuel and water. They packaged rations not as mere sustenance, but as a tool for morale. The American soldier was not just a fighter, he was the endpoint of the most sophisticated and robust supply chain the world had ever seen. This industrial miracle was powered by a social revolution. Millions of men entered the armed forces, and millions of women, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, entered the factories. They were not just replacing men, they were achieving levels of production previously thought impossible. The war effort demanded and received the collective effort of an entire nation, from the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the aluminum plants of the Pacific Northwest. The American economy, once dormant, was now running at a fever pitch, its output greater than that of all the Axis powers combined. The German military, observing from a distance, fundamentally misread this phenomenon. They saw the early Sherman tanks and American equipment as proof of their own qualitative superiority. They dismissed the American focus on mass production as evidence of a crude, materialistic culture that could not understand the finer points of war. They believed that such a system would produce inferior weapons manned by soldiers who lacked the hardened, martial spirit of the Wehrmacht. They failed to grasp the strategic implication. The United States was not building a single, perfect weapon. It was building an ecosystem of war. It was creating a system where a tank lost in combat was not a tragedy, but a statistic, because 2 more were already on a ship crossing the Atlantic. It was creating an army that would not run out of bullets, beans, or gasoline. The arsenal of democracy was not just producing weapons, it was producing certainty. It was the foundation upon which the entire Allied war effort was built, and it was about to meet the scavenger army of the Wehrmacht with a force that the German doctrine, for all its tactical elegance, had no answer to. The workshops were awake. The flood was coming, and it would wash over the battlefields of Europe in a tide of plenty that would shock the German soldier to his core. It was this mindset, forged in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front and the grinding battles of North Africa, that collided with the reality of the American way of war. The German soldier had been taught, through brutal experience, that all armies ultimately suffered the same privations. He believed the stories of American decadence and weakness were true, that their wealth would not translate to battlefield endurance. He was prepared for a fight against another hungry army. He was not prepared for what he would find when the tide turned and he began stumbling into the rear areas of the advancing American forces. The world of plenty he was about to discover would shatter his understanding of modern warfare and demoralize him in a way no single defeat ever could. The scavenger was about to walk into a horn of plenty, and the sight would forever change his perception of the enemy he faced. The first concrete evidence that the German soldier's understanding of war was fundamentally wrong did not come from a battlefield defeat, but from the contents of a dead man's pockets and the wreckage of destroyed vehicles. In the dusty expanse of North Africa and the frozen forests of the Eastern Front, long before the main American army landed in Europe, German troops began encountering the material evidence of a different kind of enemy. These initial, fragmentary encounters systematically dismantled the myth of American poverty and decadence that Nazi propaganda had so carefully constructed, replacing it with a dawning and unsettling realization of an opponent who fought with tools of unimaginable plenty. The myth had been simple and reassuring. Nazi propaganda, as articulated by figures like Joseph Goebbels, painted the United States as a racially mixed, degenerate society, weakened by jazz, consumerism, and a lack of martial spirit. The American soldier was portrayed as a gum-chewing, cowardly individualist, incapable of the collective sacrifice and hardened resolve of the German Lanzer. Crucially, this caricature extended to material wealth. Germans were told that American industry was a paper tiger, producing flashy but flimsy consumer goods, incapable of the sustained, quality production needed for total war. The American soldier, they were led to believe, was as poorly equipped as he was poorly motivated. The first cracks in this facade appeared with the arrival of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union. German soldiers launching attacks against Red Army positions began to notice strange equipment mixed with the familiar Soviet gear. They encountered rugged American trucks, Studebakers and Fords, that kept running under conditions that would cripple German vehicles. More tellingly, they started finding the personal effects of Soviet soldiers that included American canned goods, tins of ham, processed cheese, and most famously, Spam. To a German soldier subsisting on black bread and thin sausage, these rich, fatty American provisions were a shocking luxury. They were tangible proof that the enemy's rear areas were supplied with a quality of food that was unimaginable in the Wehrmacht. In the North African desert, the myth evaporated completely with the arrival of the American II Corps. When German panzer units like the Afrika Korps overran American positions after the Battle of the Kasserine Pass, they conducted their standard battlefield scavenging. What they found left them bewildered. They discovered that the average American infantryman carried a semi-automatic M1 Garand rifle, a weapon that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a man could pull the trigger, while the standard German Karabiner 98K was a bolt-action rifle holding 5 rounds. This was not a minor technical difference, it represented a staggering disparity in individual firepower. But it was the non-essential items that truly shattered the German worldview. In American packs, they found clean socks, chocolate bars, cigarettes, instant coffee, and even toilet paper. German soldiers, who considered a full bread bag a mark of good supply, were confronted with an enemy who had the logistical capacity to ship comfort items across an ocean. They found that American units had their own dedicated medical services with ample supplies of morphine and sulfur drugs, a stark contrast to the chronic shortages in their own medical corps. The most profound shock came from the wreckage of destroyed American equipment. A knocked-out Sherman tank was not a total loss to the Americans, it was often a source of spare parts. German recovery teams noted that American vehicles were designed with standardization and easy repair in mind. They found that Jeeps and trucks used interchangeable components, a concept alien to the German army with its plethora of different vehicle models, each with unique, hard-to-replace parts. These first encounters created a cognitive dissonance that German propaganda could not resolve. The enemy they had been told was weak and impoverished was, in fact, equipped with superior individual weapons, better vehicles, and an abundance of supplies that bordered on the obscene. The myth of American poverty was replaced by a new, unsettling reality. The American soldier was not just a fighter, he was a well-fed, well-equipped, and logistically supported node in a vast global network. The German soldier, the proud product of a martial culture, began to feel like a pauper facing a millionaire. The material evidence was undeniable, and it planted a seed of doubt that would grow into a profound sense of inferiority as the war progressed. They had been taught to despise American softness, but they were now confronting American hardness, the hard reality of an industrial power that could wage war without sacrificing the comfort of its soldiers. The first encounters did not just reveal new equipment, they revealed a new kind of warfare. For the German soldier, war was fought with rifles, machine guns, and artillery. For the American military, these were merely the final, visible expressions of a much deeper and more powerful weapon, the logistical system. While the Wehrmacht revered the frontline commander, the U.S. Army elevated the quartermaster to a position of near equal importance. This was not an army that simply fought, it was an army that was systematically sustained, repaired, and replenished. In the American doctrine, logistics was not a supporting function, it was the central strategy, a weapon in its own right that proved as decisive as any tactical masterstroke. The American philosophy was simple, brutal, and revolutionary: they would win by outconsuming the enemy. This was their quartermaster's war, a conflict where the ability to deliver beans, bullets, and gasoline to the front line with relentless efficiency would prove more decisive than individual acts of heroism. This doctrine was born from a cold assessment of American strengths and German weaknesses. The United States could not initially field the most veteran army, but it could field the best supplied one. It would use this advantage to grind the enemy down through sheer, inexhaustible material weight. The system's sophistication was breathtaking. It began in the factories of the United States, where standardization was sacrosanct. Every Jeep, every juice and a half truck, every radio had interchangeable parts. This simple principle allowed for miracles of repair in forward areas. A damaged truck could be cannibalized to keep 3 others running. A broken rifle could be fixed with components from another. For the Germans, whose equipment was a complex mosaic of different models and makes, this was an unattainable luxury. Their broken-down vehicles often stayed broken down, their specialized weapons becoming useless when a single unique part failed. This river of material flowed across the Atlantic in a ceaseless convoy of liberty and victory ships, a feat of maritime organization that defied the U-boat threat. Upon arrival in theater, the Red Ball Express and its equivalents became the arteries of the army. Thousands of trucks, driven around the clock by mostly African American soldiers in a segregated army, created a mobile, flexible supply line that could keep pace with a rapidly advancing front. The German army, by contrast, remained tethered to its railroads, which were systematically destroyed by Allied air power. When the rails were cut, the German advance stalled. When the rails were cut ahead of the Americans, the trucks simply found another route. The scale of consumption was what truly defined this weapon. An American infantry division in combat required over 650 tons of supplies per day. This included everything from artillery shells to rations, from replacement uniforms to blood plasma. The system was designed not for austerity, but for abundance. A single American corps could expend more artillery ammunition in a 1-hour preparatory barrage than a German corps might have for an entire week. This steel rain became the signature of American offensive operations, a blunt force trauma that obliterated enemy positions and morale alike. The quartermasters war also encompassed morale. The U.S. Army understood that a well-fed, healthy soldier fought better and longer. Thus, the system delivered not just sea rations, but also occasional fresh-baked bread, candy, cigarettes, and coffee. It delivered mail from home with a reliability that astounded their enemies. It provided regular rotations for showers and clean clothing, and it maintained a vast network of field hospitals that could evacuate and treat wounded men with an efficiency the Germans could only dream of. This logistical support was a force multiplier, sustaining the fighting spirit of the army in a way no political indoctrination ever could. For the German soldier, encountering this system was a demoralizing education. He saw that when he captured an American position, he gained a windfall of supplies. But when the Americans captured his position, they gained only ground. He watched as American artillery fired without apparent concern for shell conservation, while his own gunners were on strict allotments. He saw American infantry advance under a moving wall of explosions, a luxury his own army could rarely afford. The ultimate expression of the quartermaster's war was not in the attack, but in the defense. During the Battle of the Bulge, when the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, they were low on ammunition, but they were not starving. Aerial resupply, though imperfect, kept them in the fight. When the weather cleared, an entire fleet of cargo gliders brought in surgeons, medical supplies, and ammunition. The besiegers, by contrast, were starving and freezing, their own supply lines shattered by their rapid advance and Allied air interdiction. The Americans won at Bastogne not because they were better soldiers, but because their logistical system could sustain them in isolation, while the German system could not. In the end, the quartermaster's war proved that battles are won not just by the men who pull the triggers, but by the men who drive the trucks, manage the depots, and coordinate the convoys. It was a war of production lines and shipping manifests, of spare parts and standardized components. The American soldier was the delivery mechanism for this immense industrial power, and the German soldier, for all his courage and skill, was ultimately crushed by it. The quartermaster had delivered the victory. The German soldiers who cautiously picked through captured American positions expected to find ammunition and military hardware. What they discovered, however, went far beyond mere material. They uncovered a deliberately engineered system for maintaining the human spirit, a comprehensive psychological support apparatus that was as shocking to them as any weapon. While the Wehrmacht relied on ideological fervor and iron discipline to sustain morale, the Americans had industrialized morale itself, treating it as a quantifiable, logistical requirement no less important than fuel or bullets. This discovery revealed a chasm in military philosophy that struck at the very heart of the German soldier's identity. The first and most tangible element was food. The German soldier's ration was a functional, often monotonous provision designed for caloric survival: hard bread, preserved meat, and ersatz coffee. The American K and C rations, by contrast, were a revelation. They contained not just calories, but variety and flavor: tinned meat and vegetables, crackers, candy, chewing gum, and, most miraculously, instant coffee and cigarettes. These were not mere sustenance, they were small, tangible comforts that broke the monotony of combat and provided a moment of personal pleasure. For a German soldier accustomed to hunger and deprivation, finding these luxuries in the pack of a fallen enemy was a deeply disorienting experience. It spoke of an army that valued the individual comfort of its lowest-ranking soldier. But the American system delved much deeper. German troops overrunning rear areas found facilities that seemed to belong to a different world. They discovered mobile field kitchens that could bake fresh bread and even pies. They stumbled upon mobile laundry units, where American soldiers could have their uniforms professionally cleaned, a concept so alien it seemed like science fiction to men who had worn the same filthy uniforms for months. They found shower points where troops could wash off the grime of the front lines. These services were not occasional luxuries, they were systematically organized and integrated into the rotation of units coming out of the line. Their message was clear: the American army cared about the basic hygiene and dignity of its soldiers. The most psychologically potent discovery was the American mail service. The German postal system to the front was slow, unreliable, and often disrupted by partisan activity and the collapsing transportation network. For the American soldier, however, mail from home was a near-sacred institution, delivered with a speed and reliability that defied the chaos of war. Their V-mail system microfilmed letters stateside, shipped them in bulk, and printed them out near the front, ensuring a constant, lightweight stream of communication from loved ones. This relentless connection to the world they were fighting for was a powerful antidote to the isolation and despair of combat. For the German soldier, who received letters sporadically if at all, the sight of an American unit receiving bags of mail was a painful reminder of their own severed links to home. This engineered morale extended to entertainment and rest. The Germans learned of rest camps, where American units were rotated for hot meals, clean beds, and even USO shows featuring famous Hollywood stars. They captured copies of the American military newspaper, Stars and Stripes, which provided a professional, if censored, view of the war, alongside comics and sports scores. This stood in stark contrast to the German Wehrmacht, a dry, official communiqué that offered no distraction from the horrors of the front. The Americans had institutionalized the concept of mental rest and recreation, understanding that a soldier's spirit needed replenishment as much as his ammunition pouches. For the German soldier, these discoveries were profoundly demoralizing. They had been taught to believe in their own superior toughness and ideological commitment. They endured hardship as a test of their will. To see the enemy systematically mitigating that same hardship through organization and wealth challenged their entire worldview. It wasn't just that the Americans had more, it was that they had created an army that fought without the constant, grinding despair that defined the German experience. The enemy soldier was not just well-fed, he was psychologically sustained, reminded of home, and cared for as an individual. This focus on morale revealed a different kind of strength, one the German military doctrine had completely overlooked. The Wehrmacht believed in the power of the will. The US Army believed in preserving the will through systematic support. The German soldier was expected to endure. The American soldier was enabled to endure. This fundamental difference became a tangible force on the battlefield. An army that feels valued and connected fights with a resilience that sheer discipline cannot replicate. The shocking discovery for the Germans was not just the material comfort of their enemy, but the terrifying effectiveness of an army that had mastered the science of morale. The German concept of mobility was defined by the Panzer Division, a powerful, armored spearhead designed for decisive breakthroughs. But behind this sharp tip was a cumbersome, largely immobile shaft. The true measure of American mobility, which German soldiers encountered with growing awe and disbelief, was not found in its tanks alone, but in its trucks. The US Army was not merely a motorized force, it was a fully vehicularized one, a society on wheels where there was, quite literally, a truck for everything. This ubiquitous presence of specialized vehicles represented a level of logistical freedom and tactical flexibility that the horse-drawn Wehrmacht could scarcely comprehend. The backbone of this system was the legendary 2.5-ton truck, their Deuce and a half. Manufactured primarily by GMC, this rugged, six-wheel drive workhorse was the standard cargo truck of the US Army, produced in over 800,000 units. To the German soldier, whose own army relied on a chaotic menagerie of captured French, British, and civilian vehicles, this standardization was a revelation. It meant spare parts were universal, mechanics needed only one set of training, and any truck could be cannibalized to keep a dozen others running. They saw convoys of these identical trucks stretching to the horizon, a rolling river of olive drab that seemed to have no beginning and no end. But the Deuce and a half was just the start. The Americans had not just motorized their supply chain, they had motorized every specialized function of an army. German soldiers capturing a position would find not just cargo trucks, but a fleet of purpose-built vehicles that spoke of an army with no logistical constraints. There were fuel tanker trucks in such abundance that American armored divisions could advance for days without refueling anxiety. There were workshop trucks equipped with lathes and welding gear, mobile machine shops that could repair anything from a Jeep's engine to a tank's track. They found mobile kitchens that could keep up with the advance, and refrigerated trucks, a concept that seemed like sheer fantasy, dedicated solely to transporting blood plasma for field hospitals. The most iconic symbol of this vehicular freedom was the Jeep. Small, rugged, and incredibly versatile, the Jeep was everywhere. It was a scout car, a command vehicle, an ambulance, a weapons platform, and a general-purpose runabout. Officers used them to visit the front lines, MPs used them for traffic control, engineers used them to lay wire. To the German soldier, who associated staff cars with high-ranking officers far from the front, the sight of low-ranking American sergeants and lieutenants freely driving these vehicles was a shock. It represented a decentralization of mobility and initiative that was alien to the Wehrmacht's rigid hierarchy. This motorized ecosystem created a tactical tempo the Germans could not match. An American infantry division was not a body of men who marched, it was a body of men who rode. Their motor march meant that troops arrived at their objective fresh, not exhausted from a 20-mile foot march. Artillery batteries, with their prime movers, could shoot and scoot, displacing before counter-battery fire could find them. The entire army could advance, supply, and reposition at a speed that was dictated by engines, not by boot leather or horseflesh. The contrast with the German reality was painful and obvious. The Wehrmacht's reliance on horses was not a minor detail, it was a central, crippling feature of its logistics. Over 2.7 million horses were used by the German military in World War II. Infantry divisions moved on foot, their supplies following in horse-drawn wagons that bogged down in mud and required vast quantities of fodder, a logistical burden in itself. When a German division moved, it created a long, vulnerable column of marching men and plodding animals. When an American division moved, it was a compact, fast-moving stream of vehicles. For the German soldier, the evidence of this motorized supremacy was inescapable. He marched past the wreckage of endless American truck convoys, destroyed by Luftwaffe attacks or German armor, only to find that another convoy had already taken its place. He saw American reinforcements arriving by truck to plug a gap in the line, while his own reinforcements were still days away on foot. He saw American artillery firing from positions that had been empty hours before, their guns having been moved by truck. He learned that capturing a few American trucks was a windfall for his own unit, but it was a loss the Americans simply absorbed without notice. The ultimate expression of this was the Red Ball Express, the dedicated trucking route that fueled Patton's race across France. For the Germans, the concept of designating a highway solely for the purpose of supplying an advancing army was logistically unimaginable. It required a surplus of trucks, drivers, and gasoline that simply did not exist in their own order of battle. The motorized army was not just a convenience, it was a fundamental strategic advantage. It meant the U.S. Army could sustain its combat power over immense distances, outrun its enemy's ability to react, and bring the full weight of its industrial might to bear on any point of the front. The German soldier, trudging along a dusty road, heard the constant rumble of American truck engines and understood, with a sinking feeling, that he was fighting an enemy who had conquered time and distance itself. The final, and perhaps most psychologically devastating, revelation for the German soldier was the discovery of the American supply depot. If the frontline positions hinted at abundance, the depots confirmed a reality so far beyond the German experience that it felt like a different universe. These were not merely storage yards, they were sprawling, organized cities of material, landscapes of plenty that laid bare the absolute industrial and logistical superiority of the enemy. To walk through one was to understand that Germany was not just losing battles, it was fighting a war against a system it could never hope to match. The first shock was the scale. A single American supply depot could cover hundreds of acres, a meticulously organized labyrinth of stacked crates, parked vehicles, and drum-lined fuel farms that stretched to the horizon. German after-action reports from the Normandy breakout and the pursuit across France described these facilities with a tone of disbelief. They spoke of mountains of artillery shells, so vast that a single depot might contain more rounds than an entire German army corps had available for a major offensive. They described warehouses, often just open fields protected by canvas, containing thousands of brand new tires, enough to re-equip every vehicle in a panzer division 10 times over. The organization was as impressive as the volume. Everything was catalogued, palletized, and accessible. The U.S. Army's system of standardized crating and labeling meant that any item, from a spare radio tube to a tank engine, could be located and dispatched within hours. There were separate, dedicated areas for every class of supply: Class 1, rations; Class 3, fuel; Class V, ammunition, and so on. For German soldiers accustomed to chronic shortages and bureaucratic confusion, this seamless efficiency was as intimidating as the firepower it supported. It demonstrated a level of administrative control that their own crumbling state could no longer manage. Within these depots, the German soldier encountered categories of supply that his own army had long since abandoned as non-essential. The ration dumps were the most demoralizing. they found not just the familiar sea rations, but entire warehouses dedicated to comfort and morale. There were pallets of fresh fruit and vegetables, shipped from the United States. There were cases of candy, chewing gum, and cigarettes, not as rare treats, but as standard issue items. They found mobile bakeries producing fresh bread and even donuts, a sight that seemed utterly surreal in the context of total war. To men who had been surviving on black bread and thin soup, this was not just plenty, it was obscene wealth. The vehicle parks were another blow to German military pride. They contained row upon row of brand new jeeps, Juice-A half trucks, and armored vehicles, all painted in fresh olive drab, awaiting assignment to units. These were not the battered, cannibalized fleets the Germans were used to. This was a seemingly endless reservoir of new equipment. They saw depots dedicated solely to engines and transmissions, where a faulty power plant from a Sherman tank could be swapped out in hours, not weeks. The concept of such a deep and readily available pool of spare parts was alien to the German maintenance system, which often relied on scavenging from destroyed vehicles. But the ultimate symbol of this abundance was their knacker's yard, or salvage depot. Here, the Americans displayed a profligacy that defied German understanding. Damaged vehicles, jeeps with blown engines, trucks with shrapnel holes, tanks with broken tracks, were collected in vast fields. Some would be repaired, but many were simply cannibalized for parts and then left to rust. To the German soldier, for whom every single truck was a precious asset, this wastage was both shocking and enlightening. It revealed an enemy so rich in material that it could afford to be wasteful. The loss of 100 trucks was a statistical inconvenience, not a catastrophic blow to combat effectiveness. For the German soldier, the depot was more than a target, it was a lesson in grand strategy. It taught him that the enemy could replace its losses almost indefinitely. It taught him that while he fought with what he had, the Americans fought with what they wanted. The sheer volume of supplies meant that American commanders could plan operations without the constant, paralyzing fear of running out of ammunition or fuel. It allowed for sustained, high-intensity combat that would have exhausted German stocks in days. Standing in these depots, the German soldier finally understood the true nature of the war. He was not fighting a mere army, he was fighting the entire industrial and agricultural output of a continent-sized nation, delivered across an ocean with ruthless efficiency. The landscape of abundance was the physical manifestation of American power, a silent, overwhelming argument that eroded the will to resist. He had been taught to value grit and endurance, but in the face of such limitless plenty, his endurance seemed futile. The depots proved that the Americans could outlast him, outsupply him, and ultimately, overwhelm him not through superior courage, but through the sheer, crushing weight of stuff. While the German soldier marveled at the sheer volume of American supplies, he often missed the deeper, more profound innovation that made this volume effective, the cult of standardization. The American arsenal was not just vast, it was intelligently designed as an integrated system where every part, from the largest tank engine to the smallest radio tube, was part of a coherent, interchangeable whole. This philosophy, seemingly mundane, was in fact one of the most decisive weapons in the Allied arsenal, a tool that ensured the American war machine kept moving while the German one, for all its technical brilliance, gradually seized up. For the German military, equipment was a constant source of complexity and frustration. The Wehrmacht fought with a bewildering array of weaponry, much of it captured or purchased from occupied nations. A single infantry company might field German Mauser rifles, captured Soviet P-Pischer submachine guns, and French machine guns, each requiring different, often scarce, ammunition. Their vehicle fleet was a mechanic's nightmare: Opel Blitz trucks, French Renault UE tractors, Czech-designed tanks, and hundreds of thousands of horses, all with unique, non-interchangeable parts. This Panzer Zoo created a logistical tale that was impossibly long and fragile. A broken-down truck could not be fixed with parts from a different model, it required a specific component that might be hundreds of miles away in a depot, if it existed at all. The American approach was the polar opposite. From the outset, the U.S. War Department enforced a ruthless policy of standardization. The goal was not to produce the perfect weapon, but to produce good, reliable weapons and vehicles in staggering numbers, all using the same basic components. The legendary GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, their Juice and a Half, was the prime example. Over 800,000 were built, and every one of them shared the same engine, tires, electrical components, and drivetrain parts. A mechanic trained on one could repair any of them. A spare part salvaged from a wreck in Normandy could keep a truck running in the Ardennes. This principle extended to everything. The M1 Garand rifle, the .30 caliber machine gun, the Jeep, all were designed with mass production and easy maintenance as primary goals. The impact of this on the battlefield was transformative. An American armored division carried its own spare parts inventory and mobile workshop trucks. A broken fan belt on a Sherman tank could be replaced in minutes from standard stocks. A damaged engine could be swapped out in a matter of hours using a standardized hoist and a replacement engine that was identical to the one removed. This meant that the American teeth-to-tail ratio, the number of frontline combat troops versus support personnel, was heavily weighted toward the tail. But this was not a weakness, it was a calculated strength. It meant that a higher percentage of American tanks and trucks were operational on any given day compared to their German counterparts. The German soldier witnessed this advantage in stark terms. He saw disabled American vehicles being repaired by the roadside while his own damaged panzers, often requiring specialized factory-made components, had to be abandoned. He learned that capturing American equipment was a tremendous boon because his own mechanics could often not repair it without the specific American spare parts, which were, of course, readily available only to the Americans. The very abundance that shocked him was made effective by this web of standardization. 1,000,000 artillery shells are only useful if they all fit the barrels of your guns. 1,000 trucks are only effective if you can keep them running with a manageable inventory of parts. This system also accelerated the learning curve for the entire army. A soldier needed to learn the mechanics of only a few vehicle types. A logistician needed to manage only a handful of different ammunition calibers. This simplicity created efficiency at every level, from the factory floor to the front line. It was a force multiplier that allowed the Americans to field a massive, complex army with a surprisingly streamlined support structure. The ultimate testament to the power of standardization was the reverse Lend-Lease phenomenon. Even the German military, in its desperation, began using captured American Jeeps and trucks. They prized them not just for their quality, but for the fact that they were so much simpler to keep operational than their own heterogeneous vehicle fleet. The tool of victory was so well designed that even the enemy was forced to adopt it. In the end, the American focus on standardization and spare parts represented a different philosophy of war. The Germans worshipped at the altar of tactical and technical genius, producing exquisite but complex weapons. The Americans worshipped at the altar of logistical and industrial genius, producing reliable, interchangeable systems. The German approach produced legendary weapons like the Tiger tank. The American approach produced victory. The soldier in the field learned that the most important tool was not the rifle in his hand, but the system that ensured that rifle never ran out of ammunition, and the truck that brought him to the fight never broke down for lack of a simple, standardized part. It was a lesson in the quiet, unglamorous, and utterly decisive power of common-sense engineering. The material disparity between the American and German armies was stark, but its most corrosive effect was psychological. For the German soldier, the constant, inescapable comparison between his own state of deprivation and the enemy's staggering abundance created a deep and debilitating sense of demoralization. This was not merely envy, it was a fundamental crisis of belief that eroded his will to fight. The evidence of American wealth was a silent, pervasive propaganda that proved more effective than any Allied leaflet, convincing him that he was not just outgunned, but that he was on the losing side of history. This demoralization operated on multiple levels. The most immediate was the personal, bodily comparison. The German Lancer was often hungry, clad in worn and filthy uniforms, and plagued by minor ailments due to poor nutrition and lack of hygiene facilities. He watched as well-fed, clean-shaven American prisoners were led to the rear, their physiques robust, their teeth often intact, their uniforms comparatively new. He found in their packs not just functional rations, but chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes, items that had become unimaginable luxuries in his own life. This physical contrast was a daily humiliation. It was difficult to maintain a sense of racial or martial superiority over an enemy who was visibly healthier and better cared for. This personal deprivation was compounded by the professional comparison. The German soldier was an expert in scarcity. He knew how to conserve his last few rounds of ammunition, how to stretch a loaf of bread among his squad, how to siphon a few liters of gasoline from a wrecked vehicle. These were the skills of a desperate man. When he encountered the American system, he saw that his enemy had no need for such skills. American gunners fired artillery barrages not just for tactical effect, but to clear minefields, a profligate use of resources he found both shocking and deeply discouraging. He saw that the American army could afford to be wasteful, and that this waste was, in itself, a form of power. His own military's efficiency, born of necessity, now seemed like the poverty of a pauper counting pennies. The constant comparison also bred a profound sense of strategic despair. A German soldier might fight a brilliant local action, destroying several Sherman tanks and inflicting heavy casualties. But as he looked at the battlefield, he would see that for every tank he destroyed, the Americans seemed to have two more ready to take its place. For every artillery observer he silenced, another would appear. The enemy's strength felt renewable, like a hydra growing new heads. His own strength, by contrast, was finite and dwindling. Every bullet fired was one less in the dwindling stockpile, every comrade lost was irreplaceable. This created a chilling calculus: even if he won every battle, he was losing the war of attrition. Victory in a single engagement felt meaningless when the enemy's industrial base could negate that victory within days. Letters from home deepened this psychological crisis. While American soldiers received a steady stream of mail describing life in a nation untouched by war, German soldiers received letters filled with increasing desperation. They learned of their cities being bombed into rubble, their families going hungry, and the slow collapse of the world they were fighting to protect. The contrast between the world sustaining the American soldier and the world crumbling behind the German soldier was devastating. He was not just fighting for a cause that seemed increasingly lost, he was fighting against an enemy whose homeland was a fortress of peace and production. Perhaps the most insidious effect was the erosion of faith in their own leadership. Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed the United States as a decadent, weak, and divided Judeo-plutocracy. The reality the German soldier encountered was the precise opposite: a nation so unified and powerful it could project this incredible force across an ocean while maintaining a high standard of living for its citizens. The lies became apparent. If their high command had been so wrong about this, what else were they lying about? The enemy's material superiority became proof of their own leaders' duplicity and incompetence. This demoralization by comparison did not always lead to immediate surrender. Often, it manifested as a grim, fatalistic endurance. The German soldier continued to fight, but he fought without the belief in ultimate victory that had sustained him in the early years. He fought out of duty, fear of his own officers, or simple loyalty to the men beside him. But the corrosive knowledge of the enemy's bottomless resources was always there, a silent partner in every defensive position, a ghost in every foxhole. He knew, in a way that no propaganda could dispel, that he was facing an enemy who could not be beaten by courage alone. The Americans had weaponized their standard of living, and the psychological impact was as crippling as any bomb or bullet. The German soldier didn't just feel outnumbered, he felt obsolete. A profound and ironic twist in the logistics war was the systematic diversion of American supplies to fuel the very army they were meant to destroy. For the German soldier, American supply dumps and fallen equipment became an essential, albeit unofficial, source of sustenance and armament. This was not mere battlefield scavenging, it became a critical, if humiliating, lifeline that simultaneously sustained the Wehrmacht's fighting capacity while providing daily, tangible proof of its own inferiority. The enemy's abundance was so great that it began to feed the opposition, creating a bizarre parasitic relationship where German survival came to depend on American largesse. The most immediate and widespread use of captured goods was for basic sustenance. The discovery of American rations was a moment of celebration for a hungry German unit. C rations and K rations, with their tinned meat, biscuits, candy, and, most prized of all, instant coffee and cigarettes, were far superior to the German equivalent. these items became a form of battlefield currency. A single American chocolate bar could be traded for valuable items. A pack of Lucky Strike or Camel cigarettes was worth a small fortune. German soldiers developed a particular fondness for American canned ham and spam, which provided a level of protein and fat their own meager rations could not match. This created a surreal situation where German offensive actions were sometimes motivated, in part, by the intelligence that a certain American position was a supply point, making it a target worth seizing for its food alone. Beyond food, American equipment was eagerly pressed into German service. The Jeep was the most ubiquitous prize. Its reliability, ruggedness, and simplicity made it immensely valuable. German reconnaissance units, staff officers, and even medical personnel used captured Jeeps, often with German markings hastily painted over the original olive drab. The GMC Juice and a Half truck was another highly sought-after asset. For an army chronically short of transport, every captured American truck was a treasure, immediately put to work hauling ammunition, supplies, or troops. The Germans even produced official manuals in German for the maintenance and operation of captured American vehicles, a tacit admission of their quality and the frequency of their use. This reliance extended to weapons and ammunition. The American .30 caliber and .50 caliber ammunition was compatible with many German machine guns and could be used in a pinch. More directly, German infantrymen often picked up and used M1 Garand rifles and Thompson submachine guns from fallen American soldiers, appreciating their firepower even as they cursed their origin. There are documented instances of German units, particularly Volksgrenadier and re-echelon formations thrown into emergency frontline service, being equipped almost entirely with captured American small arms, as their own arsenals were depleted. The ultimate symbol of this paradoxical dependency was the use of American fuel. The Wehrmacht's mobility was constantly crippled by fuel shortages. Capturing an American fuel dump was a windfall that could enable a local counterattack or allow a trapped unit to escape encirclement. German panzers and trucks were sometimes refueled directly from captured American jerrycans, the very gasoline that was meant to power the advance that would destroy them. This created the deeply demoralizing spectacle of German vehicles running on American fuel to fight American tanks. However, this reliance on captured goods was a double-edged sword that ultimately cut deeper into German morale and effectiveness. First, it created a chaotic and unsustainable logistics chain. A unit armed with American rifles needed American ammunition. A unit using American trucks needed American spare parts. This further complicated the already nightmarish German supply situation, which was built around providing German ammunition and German parts. A company fighting with a mix of Mausers, Garands, and Thompsons was a quartermaster's despair. Second, and more importantly, it was a constant, humiliating reminder of German industrial failure. Every time a German soldier lit an American cigarette, ate American chocolate, or drove an American Jeep, he was acknowledging the superiority of the enemy's supply system. He was being sustained by the nation he was supposed to despise and defeat. This eroded unit cohesion and fighting spirit in a way that no propaganda could counteract. The message was clear: we cannot even feed and equip ourselves without the help of our enemy. The phenomenon of captured goods demonstrated the absolute totality of American logistical dominance. It showed that the U.S. supply system was so robust that it could even provision its enemy to a significant degree without impairing its own combat effectiveness. The Americans could afford to lose entire supply dumps. The Germans could not afford to lose the supplies they captured from them. This parasitic relationship sustained the German army in a physical sense but poisoned its spirit, making every meal, every cigarette, and every gallon of gas a lesson in its own inevitable defeat. The war material stamped USA had become the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, and that blood carried the virus of demoralization directly into its heart. The most stark and symbolic representation of the chasm between the American and German ways of war was not found in a tank's armor or a rifle's caliber, but in the fundamental energy that propelled their armies. The United States ran on a river of gasoline, a seemingly endless flow of refined petroleum that granted it supernatural mobility and firepower. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was ultimately powered by the high-consuming, slow-moving muscle of their horse. This dichotomy between the internal combustion engine and animal traction was more than a logistical detail, it was the definitive illustration of a modern industrial state waging war against a partially mechanized relic of a bygone era. The American obsession with fuel was all-consuming. The U.S. Army was the most motorized force in history. Every infantry division required thousands of gallons of gasoline per day simply to function, to move its troops in trucks, to supply its artillery with prime movers, to run the generators for its command posts, and to power the tanks of its attached armored units. The logistical planning for major operations like the Normandy breakout was, at its core, a calculation of gasoline consumption. The now legendary Red Ball Express was not primarily a food or ammunition route, it was a dedicated gasoline pipeline on wheels, with thousands of tanker trucks racing to slake the thirst of Patton's advancing Third Army. This dependency was a strength, not a weakness, because the supply was, for all practical purposes, infinite. American refineries and their vast fleet of tankers ensured that the fuel kept coming. The German reality was a desperate, losing battle against fuel scarcity. While the Panzer divisions presented an image of modern mechanized warfare, they were the exception, not the rule. The German army of World War II was the last in history to rely on their horse as its primary means of logistical transport. Over 2.7 million horses served in the German military. An infantry division required thousands of horses to pull its artillery, its supply wagons, its field kitchens, and its ambulances. This created a massive, hidden logistical burden. Their horses themselves needed constant fodder, consuming tons of grain and hay that had to be shipped to the front, competing for space on trains with ammunition and fuel. This fundamental difference dictated the tempo of operations. An American division could load its infantry into trucks and move 50 miles in a few hours. A German division covering the same distance required a multi-day march for its infantry and an even slower movement for its horse-drawn supply train. When the Americans advanced, they did so as a cohesive, fully mobile entity. When the Germans advanced, their armored spearheads often raced ahead, only to be halted as they outran their horse-drawn supply columns, a phenomenon famously called operating beyond one's reach. The battlefield consequences were devastating. During the Battle of the Bulge, the initial German success was due to surprise and concentration. But their ultimate failure was guaranteed by fuel. The offensive's ambitious goals were predicated on capturing American fuel dumps intact. When they failed to do so at Stavelot and other key locations, the spearhead of the 5th Panzer Army literally ground to a halt. Panther and Tiger tanks, technically superior to most American armor, were abandoned by the roadside with empty fuel tanks, becoming silent monuments to German logistical failure. Their crews became prisoners, not because they were outfought, but because their army could not deliver the gasoline that was as commonplace to the Americans as water. For the German soldier, the comparison was a daily source of frustration and humiliation. He marched on foot, his boots wearing thin, while he heard the constant rumble of American truck convoys. He saw his own artillery pieces, often still horse-drawn, being outmaneuvered by American Portee artillery that could be rapidly displaced by truck. He learned that a single American fuel dump contained more gasoline than his entire corps might see in a month. The sight of abandoned German tanks, their massive engines silent for lack of a few liters of fuel, while captured American jeeps buzzed around behind the lines, was a demoralizing spectacle that no amount of ideological fervor could overcome. The fuel versus horsepower dichotomy also highlighted the strategic vulnerability of Germany. Its synthetic fuel plants and the Ploesti oil fields in Romania were constant, high-value targets for Allied bombers. Every bomb that fell on a hydrogenation plant meant fewer gallons of fuel for training, logistics, and ultimately, for the panzers on the front. The United States, with its vast domestic oil fields and secure shipping, had no such vulnerability. The German war machine was fighting with a tourniquet on its fuel line, the American one was on an intravenous drip of high-octane gasoline. In the end, the contest between gasoline and horsepower was a contest between the 20th and the 19th centuries. The American army, swimming in fuel, could project power with a speed and consistency that the horse-drawn Wehrmacht could not comprehend, let alone counter. The German soldier, for all his courage and skill, was ultimately betrayed by the energy source of his army. He was a soldier of an industrial age trying to win a war with an agricultural age logistics system. The gasoline engine had rendered his horse, and the way of war it represented, obsolete. The road to Berlin was paved not with horseshoes, but with empty American fuel jerrycans, marking the path of an army that moved faster, farther, and with more power because it ran on the liquid energy of the modern world. The German soldier who surrendered in the spring of 1945 had been defeated by a weapon he never saw coming. It was not the Sherman tank, nor the P-51 Mustang, nor the atomic bomb. The weapon that broke the back of the Wehrmacht was the American logistical system, a vast, impersonal, and relentlessly efficient machine that transformed the nation's industrial might into battlefield victory. The ultimate lesson of World War II for the German military, learned at terrible cost, was that amateurs study tactics, but professionals study logistics. Courage, training, and even tactical brilliance could not prevail against an enemy who had mastered the science of supply. The shock that reverberated through the German ranks, from the lowest Lanzer to the highest staff officer, was the realization that the Americans had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. For centuries, war had been a contest of wills fought by armies that shared similar constraints of supply and endurance. The American approach shattered this paradigm. They did not just have more of everything, they had created a system where the concept of running out was virtually eliminated. This was not merely quantitative superiority, it was a qualitative revolution in military affairs. The battlefield was no longer just a geographical space, it was the endpoint of a global supply chain that began in the factories of Detroit and the oil fields of Texas. The German soldier's entire experience of the war was defined by scarcity. He was an expert in conservation, in making do, in stretching his last reserves of ammunition, fuel, and food. He fought with the constant anxiety of depletion. The American soldier, by contrast, fought with the psychological freedom of abundance. He could fire his weapon without counting every round. His commanders could plan operations without the paralyzing fear that their attack would stall for lack of gasoline or shells. This freedom allowed for a tempo of operations that the Germans could not match. The American army could sustain a high-intensity offensive for weeks on end, an impossibility for the fuel-starved, ammunition-rationed Wehrmacht. This logistical dominance neutralized Germany's greatest advantages. The tactical genius of German junior officers, the superior armor of the Panther and Tiger tanks, the combat experience of veteran infantry, all of these were rendered irrelevant by the sheer, grinding weight of American material. A Tiger tank might destroy 5 Shermans, but the 6th would knock it out, and 3 more would take its place the next day. A German machine gun nest might hold up a battalion, but it would be obliterated by an artillery barrage that expended more shells in an hour than a German battery might fire in a week. The Americans had turned war into a mathematical equation, and the numbers were overwhelmingly in their favor. The psychological impact of this logistical warfare was perhaps its most devastating effect. The German soldiers' morale was not broken in a single, catastrophic battle, but was slowly eroded by 1,000 small demonstrations of enemy wealth. Every captured K-ration, every working jeep, every mountain of supplies in a depot, every endless convoy of trucks, each was a silent argument against the possibility of victory. It bred a deep-seated fatalism, a sense that they were fighting not just an army, but an entire economic system that could not be defeated by martial skill alone. The constant comparison between their own poverty and the enemy's plenty was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda. The legacy of this lesson extends far beyond the fields of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. The American victory in World War II established a new template for modern warfare, one where logistical capacity and industrial production are the true determinants of victory. Their arsenal of democracy was not a slogan, it was a strategic reality. The war proved that a nation's ability to produce, transport, and maintain its military equipment is as important as the courage of the soldiers who use it. For the German soldiers who witnessed it firsthand, the American logistical system was a source of awe, envy, and ultimately, despair. They had been taught to believe in the supremacy of the German fighting spirit. They discovered that spirit was powerless against an enemy who had eliminated scarcity from the battlefield. The GI, with his semi-automatic rifle, his endless cigarettes, and his jeep, was not a better soldier. But he was the representative of a better system, a system that could feed him, supply him, and replace his losses indefinitely. The ultimate lesson was clear: Logistics is not a part of war, it is the foundation upon which wars are won. The nation that can best sustain its army in the field will triumph, no matter how brilliant its tactics or how brave its soldiers. The Americans did not just bring an army to Europe, they brought an entire economy, and that, in the end, was a force that no amount of German courage could withstand.